Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Hello, welcome everybody to today's Wednesday lunch here at the Divinity School. I'm Taryn Lyon, I'm the Director of Communications. I organize these series, and as always, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our program today. We do have a big program for today, so I want to keep this portion of our lunch short, but I have to thank Blair and our crew for today's delicious meal. Say hi to Blair's mom. Say happy birthday to Wes, our Director of Field Education. We do ask that you bus your own station on your way out. Are these plates okay for compost or no?
Yes.
Yeah, so you can compost your plates and your bowls and your food and throw away your garbage and put your silverware in the soapy vat, and we appreciate all that. And we also appreciate if you would turn off your cell phone ringer, noisemakers. Is there any?
There are still 2 days to apply to register for the Craft Teaching Syllabus Workshop. As you know, the course design is a central theme in the Craft Teaching program. And if you're interested in participating in the syllabus workshop, please send an email to Professor Lucy Pick with the title of the course, a short paragraph description, and a list of readings and topics that you'd like to cover, and do it by Friday.
Terry? Fiona?
Yes. One important event that's coming up, sponsored by the Diversity Committee on March 2nd. You should have received an email from me with the poster. We're having a panel, the important march from Selma to Montgomery that began with a bloody confrontation on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The 50th anniversary is on March 7th. So on March 2nd, we will have a panel that will feature Emeritus faculty Martin Marty and Professor Franklin and Chris Gamwell, who were 2 of 5 Divinity School faculty members who actually answered the call to go to Selma, along with current faculty Curtis Evans and Professor Jane Daly from the History Department, moderated by Professor Dwight Hopkins. It's sponsored by the Diversity Committee, so it'll be a wonderful opportunity to hear from people who were there and to have a discussion about lessons that we can learn from that kind of organized strategic action in light of recent events. So I hope you'll all come. It'll be at 6 p.m. on the 2nd, on Monday, with a reception to follow here in the common room. So I hope to see you all there. It promises to be a really, really exciting conversation and a wonderful opportunity to hear from people that we know and love about what that experience was about.
Next Monday and Tuesday will be the second candidate for the New Testament Early Christian literature position. So if anybody's interested in that, we'd like as many people to come as possible. Monday evening at 4:30 is a public lecture, and then the next day, Tuesday morning at 9, there's a conversation and little small breakfast with the candidate, who is David Brackey. And then at noon, there's a noon luncheon workshop with the candidate. And you can find more details either on one of the newsletters for the week or on the Early Christian Studies blog.
Today's Wednesday lunch is a Dean's Forum, which invites some of our faculty to speak on a piece that they've written. So I'm going to turn over the rest of the introductions to our Dean, so she can introduce the Dean's Forum. So please join me in welcoming our Dean, Margaret Mitchell. She'll announce the you have the Early Christian Literature. Sorry.
Looking forward to this day for quite some time. This is a real treat for us at Swift Hall to recognize a monumental work of scholarship with the author, Professor Anthony C.U., and 2 respondents. I'm going to make very brief introductions of all 3, very truncated, and then I'm going to introduce the work that is the subject of this Dean's Forum, and then Professor Yu will speak and introduce this thoroughly revised Journey to the West that we're celebrating today, and then Professor Doniger, and then Professor Ziporyn will respond, and we'll have some dialogue among our participants and on the panel, and as we have time with the audience, or afterwards, if we have to break for you to get to class, come on up and continue the dialogue up here. Anthony C.U. is Carl Darlingbuck Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus in the Humanities Division and Professor Emeritus of Religion and Literature in the Divinity School. He also holds appointments in the Departments of Comparative Literature, East Asian Languages and Civilizations, and English Language and Literature, and the Committee on Social Thought. Educated with an STB from Fuller Theological Seminary, Professor Yu holds a PhD in Religion and Literature from the University of Chicago Divinity School. Among his many publications, the 4-volume Journey to the West is the work that we'll be celebrating today, completed in 1983 in its first edition, and now its second edition, University of Chicago Press, 2012. More about Professor Yu's work and that accomplishment in a moment. Wendy Doniger is Mircea Eliade Distinguished Service Professor of the History of Religions, and also in the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations, the Committee on Social Thought, and the College. She holds the MA and PhD from Harvard University and the DPhil from Oxford University, also that she can have summer and winter versions of academic garb to wear at graduations. Among her many books most recently are The Hindus, An Alternative History, and On Hinduism, and this last year appeared the Norton Anthology of World Religions, of which she was the editor of the Hinduism section. Professor Doniger is also a distinguished translator who has published translations, among other things, on the Rig Veda and the Kama Sutra. And if you haven't seen the magnificent university-wide university news piece on translators at the University of Chicago that figures the work of Professor Yu and Professor Doniger, go there. It's on our homepage. It's also, of course, on the university's homepage. Brook Ziporyn is Professor of Chinese Religion, Philosophy, and Comparative Thought. He holds the BA from the University of Chicago, East Asian Languages and Civilizations concentration, and the PhD from the University of Michigan. Professor Ziporyn is the author of 6 published books, beginning with Evil and or As the Good, Omnicentric Holism, Intersubjectivity, and Value Paradox in Scientific Buddhist Thought, and most recently, Beyond Oneness and Difference, Li and Coherence in Chinese Buddhist Thought and its Antecedents, SUNY Press, 2013. So I brought a few props today. The first is just, we can't talk about this book without you seeing what an enormous thing we are speaking about. All 4 volumes of the Journey to the West. I had to have a shopping bag to bring them in today, and I also have a magnificent author-signed copy from Professor Yu, which is a treasured possession in our home and will remain such. I brought also another prop. I don't know if you know, but the Dean's office has a variety of religious and other paraphernalia in it. It has a statue of Artemis from Ephesus, for example, and a statue of Apollo. It also has a statue of the Monkey King. And this statue of the Monkey King was given to me by Paul Cheng, doctoral candidate in history of Christianity, who's in the back of the room. And the Monkey King has graced my shelves for several years now, and the Monkey King deserves to be here at the session today. So actually, I'm going to take him out of this little box so he doesn't fall over into our speakers. So the Monkey King is here.
Is he safe? I don't want it to slide down. Maybe you want to put it at a more level.
Give him his own chair.
Give him his own chair? Okay. I hope that the camera can reach down enough to see the Monkey King enthroned there. The book, multi-volume work around which we assembled today, is this new, thoroughly revised edition of Professor Anthony C. Yu's The Journey to the West, an edition and translation with extended introduction of the 16th century classic novel. This is a work of translation. It is a work of history of religions analysis. It is a work of deft and keen literary criticism. It is a work of religion and literature at its finest exposition. When the original four-volume set was completed, in a review in 1983 in the New York Times, Professor David Lattimore of Brown University said that the work by Professor Yu, quote, completes one of the great ventures of our time in humanistic translation and publication. So how can one improve on such an encomium, such a statement of scholarly achievement? To do it again. And so I'd like to call Professor Yu forward and invite him to introduce this magnificent re-edition of The Journey to the West, followed by respondents from two esteemed colleagues. Professor Yu.
It is really a great joy for me to walk these halls again that I've walked for almost 50 years. I'm honored to have been invited by Dean Mitchell for this forum on most likely the last major work of my career in life. And I'm doubly grateful for my two commentators here, one who is now my oldest active colleague, and one who is among the newest that I'm meeting for the first time. A second happy coincidence is that Professor Doniger, as many of you know, is the first person featured on the university website write-up this month celebrating scholarly translations by faculty. Finally, and with no intention of slighting Ash Wednesday, tomorrow happens to be New Year's Day for the lunar calendar, ushering in the Chinese year of, and now translation is difficult, ram, goat, or sheep, or kid even. The animal that defies translation, the character, neatly, that rhymes, however, with the one of the two fundamental forces of the universe by Chinese thought, yin and what? Yang, governing the ancient Chinese cosmos. Today's event is an auspicious one for me because the animal yang, a homophone of yang, that rhythmic energy is further symbolized by an unbroken line in the trigram system of Yi Jing, or the classic of change. Beginning, the way this works, beginning in November with one unbroken line in the imagistic representation of the season, the trigram adds another line each month until January. That is in the Chinese calendar. One commentary on this trigram says 3 lines of yang, all right, reverts to prosperity, san yang kai tai. And so we are seeing the sunshine despite the cold. I have actually prepared to talk a little bit about 3 things of the translation, but because of time, and I want to have the best time for my colleagues and also for you to raise questions before we close at the appointed hour, I'm going to just touch on 2. One, on translation and language. My formal education up to my taking the doctorate here at Chicago was focused entirely on Western languages, literature, and thought. And my knowledge of my own Chinese tradition derived almost entirely from familial and home private tutoring. The knowledge of English was enlarged progressively by modern and ancient European languages, but their use, including translation activities, was limited only to short pieces or fragments as needed by critical writing for class or later professional work. Deciding to translate entirely this huge late Ming novel was thus a sudden plunge into deep water where, with scant knowledge or experience of swimming. An act of fools diving in where gods and demons fear to tread or swim. The deep water analogy is warranted because there is no option for other means of support. Whereas a student writing on some foreign text, like myself, may pick and choose what portion accommodates a person's level of comprehension and labor. A plenary translation of any text offers no such choice. You either do the whole thing, swallow the whole thing, or you don't do it. That is why Professors Roy Doniger and I all affirm that our kind of translation likely makes the most severe demand on one's ability to read a text. I would hasten to add that close reading is not the only difficult demand of such translation, because another aspect of the labor requires rigorous attention to such other features as rhetoric, style, tone, and an educated calculation of comparably intended effects in at least 2 languages. I'll give one example by citing the famous episode when the chapters in the full-length novel 42 to 44, when the mischievous monkey hero made fun of wayward Taoist priests, actually animal spirits, by making them drink his and his fellow companions' urine as holy water. Arthur Weasley's translation of this and other selected portions of the novel in 1943, almost 70 years ago, was justly praised for conveying the rollicking humor, often scatological, of the original. But his abridgment also leaves out parts that are crucial to one's understanding of the story here. If one looks at my version of the same episode, now fortunately excerpted, unbeknownst to me until I saw it, in Volume 2 of the New Norton Anthology of World Religions, one will find that the narrative is dramatically punctuated by 4 sets of hilarious limericks, which Wendy just ignored. Monkey declaimed 2 of them in brazen mockery against the Taoist Trinity and their deviant disciples, and his declamations bookend 2 other limericks chanted by the animal spirits to plead for the gift of holy water. Granted due attention, the 4 slapstick poems present a hilarious mimicry of what? Of religious and ritual poetry of the Chinese. The clipped brevity, metrical rhythm, mostly 4 syllables, and rhyme no less than the incongruous pairing of classic and demotic diction deliberately parody lines of the classic of poetry, one foundational text of ancient Confucianism, the prosodic patterns of which were mined by both Taoist and Buddhist liturgical texts and performance. So the satire is not just one level. When these poems were really read in the Chinese and understood, and I've tried to, I won't take your time now, but I can read a couple of them for you. I brought the volume, it's in Volume 2, and you will see what I mean. the poems themselves, these crazy limericks, are actually attacking three traditions all at once and making fun of them, all right, and having roaring fun without ever mentioning the target. In this manner, the comic narrative actually satirizes all three religions, just in that little tiny few pages. Now, a quick word about the content and significance of religion in the fiction, and that's going to be my final point. My work on the novel profited initially, way back in the early 1970s, from the standard modern Japanese translation, which already identified the specific Taoist origin of about half dozen poems in the novel. Further research was constantly stimulated by an unusual source of knowledge for me, the ongoing volumes in Joseph Needham's massive Science and Civilization in China. My translation and teaching during the last 3 decades also coincided, very luckily, with the international community's accelerated research in Chinese Taoism, led in Europe by the erudite Christoph Stieper and his collaborators. Rick himself is an ordained Taoist priest whose mastery of his order's writings is truly encyclopedic, attested by the 3-volume historical companion to the Taoist canon he co-edited with Francis Verlan and published in 2004 by the University of Chicago Press. And I'm very proud to have my editor, David, here with us today. It represents the first complete survey in any language of all 2,000 plus titles of that scriptural thesaurus. And those of you who are majoring in either Hebrew scriptures or the New Testament, think how lucky you are. Think how many titles do you have to master before the Taoist Bible, all right? Despite the novel's explicit use of the quest for Indian Buddhist scripture theme, criticism of the novel's linguistic content increasingly recognizes its diversity that dramatizes the so-called 3 religions in one rhetoric and practice. The growing consensus from both Chinese and non-Chinese scholars is that the tale is arguably more Taoist than Buddhist or Confucian, thus confirming some insights by the yet unknown but named author of the 1592 preface to the earliest printed version and by most of the pre-modern commentators. That classification, however, is complicated. Historical Taoism of almost 2 millennia is less a homogeneous phenomenon than a tradition of varying organizations, doctrines, and practices. The novel's manifest character seems to orient itself deeply towards the Xuanzang order, 2 main divisions or lineages, south and north, of which were founded in the 11th and the 12th centuries. Despite some important doctrinal differences, the 2 divisions' most significant contribution to the history of Chinese religion is their unambiguous appropriation and adaptation of Zen Buddhism to reformulate its teaching on mental discipline as an integral path to alchemical self-realization. Now again, you have already 3 levels of linguistic meaning beginning to roll out, as it were, when that happens. Formation of the inner elixirs is one's body, with implications for attaining longevity. That's the alchemy part. Becomes synonymous with perceiving the true Buddha natures in one's own life, the manifestation of Buddhahood. That's the other level. And yet, this is also taken as simply something that they talk about and banter about. An immense physical distance, intimating paradoxically protracted travel or instantaneous traversal, provides apt metaphors for gradual or sudden enlightenment. As I've tried to indicate throughout my introduction in the revised edition and the copious annotations of identifiable Taoist sources, the novel's use of language seems to reveal something much more than substituting one belief or meaning for another. What the author or final redactor has grasped instinctually is the native or inherent emptiness of the verbal sign and its boundless freedom for random association with sound and sense. The multiplicity of allegory already funded the syncretistic usurpation of Zen Buddhist discourse. In the novel, this conception of language even more ingeniously enables the writing of one epic story, beginning with the naming of the stone-born monkey of chapter 2 by etymological allegory as inventive as Greek decipherment of Homeric poetry. I'm very happy that this kind of auspicious wife, Professor Glenn Most, who teaches Comlit and social thought, just posted his most recent article because he gave a talk 2 weeks ago on this campus on what? On etymological allegory. Yes, those of you who want to, you can Google and you get it done and you see what I'm trying to get at. And then read chapter 2 of the monkey. And you will see how, and this kind of etymological game, which is also serious, has been played by Chinese since they invented those little scribbling, chicken feet type characters. Sun Wukong, the simian disciple of the fictive monk, where is he? Yeah. Can signify, and here, listen to this, zodiac periods, temporal units by the hour, day, or year, the mind and its recalcitrant double, loyal acolyte and adversarial demon, phasal energetics construed as metal, and stages in self-cultivated enlightenment, all of which significance weaving continuously a patterned tapestry of captivating narration. Such understanding of language, so strikingly modern, is rooted firmly in Taoist thought. I don't know its name, declares the ancient Lao Tzu, and so I style it Wei, and reluctantly assigning it the name Great, unquote. Philosophically minded readers may detect in this blatant bit of nominalism a promising hint of metaphysics. Not as blatant as grounds for being for our coffee shop. The novel's author, however, might have been irresistibly inspired to write incomparable fiction. Dr. Hu Shi, eminent Chinese philosopher and literary historian, and John Dewey's pupil, who delivered the first Haskell lecture on this campus, another connection to the Swift Hall, wrote in his preface for Arthur Waley's 1943 translation that Journey to the West is a, I quote, a novel of profound nonsense. Today, he tempts me to reply by paraphrasing Winston Churchill's famous jibe at cowardly French generals. Some profundity, some nonsense. Thank you.
Professor Doniger. It's a great honor to reply to my beloved and long-standing colleague. The translation, Anthony Yu's translation of Journey to the West, is a work of extraordinary erudition. He's told you about beginning his work in the Western classics and then coming back to his own tradition. There's a line on page 32 in the introduction where he's discussing the incorporation of poetry into prose and saying it's, of course, not unique to Chinese vernacular fiction. He goes on, For distant Western parallels, one may point to the early satiric fragments of Oedipus, the later Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, a work like Aucassin and Nicolet, and the writings of Bunyan and Rabelais. So how many of us could point to all of that in one sentence, just like that? It's of course a great translation, and the author shares with me a feeling of the importance of translation as one of the cornerstones of knowledge. I've always been angry indeed, that translations are very often not counted for tenure, because they're regarded as sort of mechanical works. You have to have your ideas and something. But of course, translations are ideas, and many great translations really are works of art, as this certainly is. As Professor Yu said in the undergraduate interview that Dean Mitchell referred to, that's posted, without translation there cannot be Western culture and there cannot be Western knowledge. Indeed, without translation there cannot be culture and knowledge at all. Professor Yu's acquaintance with the journey to the West began when he and his family were fleeing to mainland China after Japan had occupied his native city of Hong Kong in 1941. And this is a quote from the undergraduate article. To shield and distract him from the horrors of war, his grandfather would entertain the 3-year-old Yu with stories about Monkey or Piggy, popular characters in Journey to the West. So it obviously has very deep meaning to him, and it's wonderful that he's rounding out a great academic career with this work. His new introduction to the second edition is a major piece of scholarship. He speaks of the supramundane, the mythic, and indeed the religious themes and rhetoric that pervade the entire work, all of which were previously ignored in other understandings of the work. It's a story of a monk and a monkey, or as he puts it in his abridged translation, a monkey and a monk, and some others too, who go from China to India to get Buddhist texts and have many adventures along the way before they come back to China with the texts. And my colleague Brook Ziporyn is going to tell you about China, so let me talk about India and its relationship to this great work. As an Indologist, I soon learned that there was a lamentable lack of reliable historical evidence in ancient India, texts longer than copper plate or stone inscriptions, which we do have, that you could date. A lack of historical rather than fictional texts that gave you straightforward data about what was actually going on. Among the very first reliable historical sources are the records left by 2 Chinese pilgrims who journeyed to India in the 5th century CE, and whom I learned about through Samuel Beale's 1869 text, Travels of Fatien and Sun Yun, Buddhist Pilgrims from China to India, 400 AD and 1518 AD. Beale's character Sun Yun is the hero of Journey to the West. Now, how do you pronounce Xuanzang? Xuanzang. So what he called Sun Yun is Xuanzang, the hero of Journey to the West. For me, it was very strange to see the hero of factual reporting in my world here transformed back to the fiction from which his actual diaries rescued us, or so we thought, in the 19th century. In his new introduction, Professor Yu argues strongly for an important Indian source for many of the stories in this novel. He says more scholarship has steadily recognized that the fund of shared motifs with India, a rather large one, cannot be easily ignored. And he cites new scholarship since the first edition of the book about the Ramayana and the monkey Hanuman and their relevance to this. Victor Mayer's 1989 essay and A.K. Ramanujan's essay on 300 Ramayanas, and also Philip Luckendorf's Hanuman's Tale, all Chicago works about the variety of Ramayanas, and particularly the importance of the monkey Hanuman. There's a convergence of Chinese and Indian motifs in a body of monkey lore. And most important, also the actions of the monkey in the book constitute a fundamental element of Indian religiosity, encompassing both Hinduism and Buddhism, in which a huge variety of known animals and mythical beasts has been pressed into ritual service to the gods. and this is something that I've also written on in these intervening years. One of the things about the monkey is the humor, and it's a very funny novel. It's a long novel, but it's a very funny novel. And the monkeys are particularly funny, and they're funny in the Ramayana also. They get drunk one day eating the fruit of a tree, and they pee in inauspicious places, and they talk dirty, they fall down. Hanuman himself is a comic character, worrying all the time. If I tell her this will happen, something bad will happen, very nervous and so forth. And the Chinese work has this same humor about monkeys. A question for Professor Yu, are there talking monkeys elsewhere in Chinese literature? So this is the first of a number of questions I want to raise very briefly about whether things come from India because they're found in India, or whether they might also be found in China and indeed elsewhere. So do we really need the Ramayana to give us the idea that monkeys can talk and are very funny? Other motifs from Indian texts come in here. The hunter who accidentally kills a person whom he mistakes for an animal, which is a big Indian motif, also comes in the Journey to the West. Using rings and bracelets to identify women in captivity, also from the Ramayana. And the instance that Professor Yu just mentioned of tricking someone into drinking urine because calling it holy water comes straight out of the Mahabharata, where a sage who, the king of the gods, pees in front of a sage to whom he's been forced to give the elixir and doesn't want to. He says, drink it, it's the elixir. The guy says, are you out of your mind? And he goes back, he says, I offered it to him. So this too is a well-known Indian motif. So my question is, are these necessarily only Indian motifs, or could they have gotten into the Journey of the West and other places? One chapter in particular seems very Indian. It's the much disputed chapter 9 about the birth of the hero. Sinologists think it is problematic, and Professor Yu says that against general scholarly advice, he includes it in his work because he thinks it's essential to the plot as a whole, even though he says it was not part of the 100-chapter novel's earliest known version. Moreover, this controversial chapter, whether or not it's authentic, is a moot question, and he says because all the Ming and Qing full-length editions of the novel known to us do include these fictional details. And Professor Yu says the importance of it is that it links the human pilgrim and the Tang court. That linkage, he says, most true but also most false, has profound implications for shaping the meaning of both the human pilgrim's character and his mission. So what is this disputed chapter? It's a chapter about the birth of the hero. It begins with the pilgrim's prenatal identity as the Buddha's disciple, his exile to the human world for inattentiveness during a lecture by the Buddha. This is an Indian theme from the great Kashmir collection, The Ocean of the Rivers of Story, where many of the human characters are not really humans. They're people who are exiled to Earth because they didn't listen carefully when the gods were talking to them. So this might have come from Kashmir, which is, after all, right on the great Silk Route from Tibet and China and India. The story of the young boy is that his father is murdered by a pirate. His mother, in order to save him from the murderous king, puts him on a plank and floats him down a river. There's a story in the beginning, I should read it really, about the father. He buys a golden, this is before the murder, okay. Let me go back. I'm trying to summarize, it's too good to summarize. Let me just tell it to you. The pilgrim's father-to-be journeys with his beautiful wife to his new post. He buys a golden carp to cook, but the fish blinks its eyes vigorously, which Gangru knows is a sign that this is no ordinary fish. He throws the live fish back into the river where it's caught. He continues the journey. A pirate kills him and throws him into the river and takes his beautiful wife, who knows she is pregnant. The pirate pretends to be Gangui and takes up his post. Meanwhile, a yaksha, that's a kind of a magical being, finds the murdered body, takes him down in the water to the Dragon King, who recognizes him as my benefactor, for the Dragon King was the golden carp that he'd thrown back into the river. He puts the soul back into the body of the murdered man and keeps him there safely under the water. Meanwhile, the wife up on top gives birth to a son A voice tells her that her husband had been rescued by the Dragon King and that the two of them and the child will be reunited, but meanwhile, that the pirate will try to kill the child. Now, here's an interesting line. I'm just summarizing. Now let me quote. She was afraid that future recognition would be difficult, so she bit her finger and wrote a letter with her blood stating in detail the names of the parents, the family history, and the reason for the child's abandonment. She also bit off a little toe from the child's left foot to establish a mark of his identity. End quote. So then she put a garment on him, floated him on a plank down the river, and the abbot of a temple fished him out, named him Xuanzang. And 18 years later, the children tease him, saying, "You don't know your own name, you're ignorant of your own parents." So he asks the abbot, who tells him about the plank and shows him the letter written in blood, and he resolves to find his mother and avenge his father. He finds her, quote, "She noticed that in speech and manner he bore a remarkable resemblance to her husband." End quote. He tells her who he is. "What proof have you of your identity?" she asks him. He shows her the letter and the garment. One look told her that they were the real thing. Finally, the lady asked him to remove his shoes and stockings, and she saw that there was indeed a small toe missing from his left foot. Once again, the two of them embraced and wept. Then they go to the Tang Emperor, which is the important connection, who captures the pirate, has his heart and liver gouged out for him while he is alive, and on the spot where the father had been thrown into the river, burns them as libations with an essay eulogizing the father, and another yaksha, magical creature, brings the essay down to the Dragon King, who summons the father, sends him back up alive to his wife, and they tell one another their stories. So, is this an Indian story? Well, there are certainly Indian versions of this story. The fish that returns a favor and rescues someone from a river is the story of the sage Manu. It's one of the avatars of Vishnu, is the fish. The Yaksha is an Indian character. The son whose life is threatened and crosses a river to escape is the story of Krishna. Recognition by feet. In the Mahabharata, Kunti recognizes her son Karna by his foot, so he doesn't bite off his toe. And then, of course, there's the Cinderella story more widely. And here we get into the question of the wider distribution of this story. Cinderella story is actually a Chinese story that gets to France through Mongolia. The criterion of beauty is small feet, after all. And originally it was a fur slipper, which in medieval French, which is when this story happened, to make its transfer across country. Now, the word for fur is vera, and the word for glass is verre. So the fur slipper in Mongolia becomes a glass slipper in France, and so we have a cross-cultural story. So what about this particular form of recognition by biting off the boy's toe? I don't know any version of that anywhere. So to conclude with a question about whether this is an Indian influence on the journey to the West or something broader, many of these details, especially when we look closer at them, are also part of a theme much broader even than the great ocean of Indian stories. The recognition narrative, what Freud calls the family romance, the child threatened by a wicked ruler, abandoned by his mother, saved and adopted, often by or with the help of a fish or another animal. Think of Romulus and Remus, for example. And finally, recognized when he's grown up through multiple forms of evidence, like the letter and the garment. It's also the theme of Pericles, which is just recently playing in Chicago Shakespeare. This always available, never copyrighted folklore has been brought in from India or elsewhere to establish the magical birth of the hero, to plug a hole in the narrative, as indeed it was imported into the Christian Gospels. The infant threatened by a tyrant, raised among animals, the manger, returning in the end to his true father in a higher world. The journey to the West drew on a world of stories and made them uniquely Chinese. Anthony Yu's translation is, in addition to everything else, a major contribution to this great wealth of world mythology. Professor Ziporyn.
First, I would like to thank the Dean for inviting me to participate in this discussion today among this very distinguished company and on such an entirely agreeable occasion. It is indeed a great pleasure and honor to have the opportunity to celebrate the new edition of Professor Yu's Journey to the West translation, a chance to explore in depth the excitements and insights of the new version, and share some thoughts on this monumental scholarly achievement, which has for the first time brought to the English-speaking world complete access to this masterpiece of Chinese literary and religious culture. The Journey to the West, COT, is one of those rare works in world literature that bears an instantly recognizable flavor which is saturated in equal measure both with playful humor, often alluded to already, and with high seriousness, I'd say, addictively entertaining as a reading experience, and yet persistently provocative as an exploration of the deepest conundrums of spiritual life, as expressed and experienced in the idiom of the religious traditions of late imperial China, particularly those of Chinese Chan and Japanese Zen Buddhism and Xuanzang Taoism, which remain somewhat poorly understood and understudied in the Anglophone world. It is, of course, one of the great virtues of Professor Yu's edition that it has so fulsomely and effectively bucked the trend in post-May 4th Chinese scholarship to marginalize the religious allegory of the novel, which he has shown in his great introduction, to this expanded introduction, to have been central to the traditional reception of the work, and which his own reconstructions and the hard, detailed labor of translation have restored to the reader's eyes in all its deep intertextual symbolic intricacy. To have made this appeal to an English reader, not only in the abstract demonstrations of the introduction and supporting scholarly apparatus, but even in the surface of the prose, is one of the great and exciting achievements of the current edition, especially, I think. The new edition, besides converting the transliterations into the Han Pinyin system, which has now become standard, thereby integrating the work into the present-day internationalization of Chinese culture, is also noteworthy for the revisions of the prose style, which have achieved, in my view, a greater economy and sort of sleekness of tone, a brisker and more compressed rhythm, which strikes me as contributing greatly to the overall impact of the work, for the tighter and more streamlined flow of English prose in the new edition comes significantly closer to transmitting the comic allegro of the novel, as it reads in the original Chinese, the light feet and lack of ponderousness with which the original text elusively treats the heaviest subjects, even in the midst of its vastness and its leisurely expansiveness through 100 chapters. I know well from my own experience, also having tried my hand at translating idiosyncratic Chinese writing, in particular the Xuanzang, how particular it is, how difficult it is to calibrate the tonal qualities of such writing, trying to calculate in the total sweep of implications of the words in both the source and the target languages, trying to recreate somehow not just the meaning, but the overall visceral impact of a particular left turn of phrase or unexpected leap in the language. To do this successfully requires an almost impossible mastery of a vast network of semantic and phonetic traces and echoes and resonances in both languages, and an intuitive sense of the particular morphology of that language at that particular time and place of its production, and of this language in the current state of play in our own culture. I feel keenly the limits of my own abilities in this regard when I am forced, with great reluctance, to revisit my Xuanzang translation, for example, in class. And I find that there is almost no line in that work which I have not reconsidered and wished I could tweak or invert since it was published. The translation of such a work is a constant work in progress, a process that doesn't end when the manuscript goes off to the printers. As Brian Eno is supposed to have said about recorded music, it is never really finished, just sort of given up on. So, I can well understand if Professor Yu has been ceaselessly haunted by the possibility of adjusting and reworking details of his originally already surpassingly skillful translation over these many years. I envy him the opportunity to put out a new edition, which can reflect so many decades of intense engagement with the text. And in surveying the new translation, I can only conclude that this must be the only way to really do it right. Witnessing Professor Yu's success in this endeavor makes me acutely aware of how difficult and rare it is, and yet holds out the hope that it is really possible to accomplish. It's a great good fortune for the Anglophone world to have in its hand now the fruit of this decades-long labor, which requires for its successful completion such a statistically unlikely combination of deep knowledge, innate intellectual skills, iron discipline, abundant expanses of available time, all converging in a single scholar, a single scholarly work. Such a convergence doesn't happen often, and we are lucky to have the resulting crystallization in the gem of a book we have before us today, before me today. I'd like to say some words, that said, about some of the thematic currents identified in Professor Yu's introductory discussion of the text. Professor Yu's scholarship has laid bare a key conceit of the novel, namely the poetic license taken with its protagonist and his relationship to official power. The historical Xuanzang was a brilliant independent thinker and translator in his own right, and also an intrepid religious outlaw, undertaking his journey to India in a spirit of heroic defiance, braving not just great physical danger, but also explicit imperial interdiction, moved not by loyalty to the state, but by religious fervor and a rare intellectual probity and undaunted will to pursue at any cost the truth on which, in his view, his spiritual liberation depended. The Xuanzang of the novel, in sharp contrast, is on an official mission from the emperor and is something of a comic figure, a coward and a hypocrite and a sycophant, never slow to boast of this official endorsement in his nervous, somewhat buffoonish encounters with all who stand in his way. Professor Yu has illustrated the necessity of this transformation in the hands of the religious poet behind the novel, the crucial role it plays in making vivid all the vicissitudes of the human spirit as conceived in the Chan and Xuanzang traditions, allegorized in the expanded figure of the little band of human and animal pilgrims whose interrelations mirror the struggles and synergies between the various aspects of the body and mind of the human religious practitioner working through his attachments, his biases, his fears, his illusions on the way to a fervently sought total transformation and integration at the end of his journey. Professor Yu draws on an interesting parallel between this shift in the private-public, obedient, transgressive relation enacted in the character of Xuanzang, and an ambiguous relation to language and cultural mediation in general, so prominent in the Chan and Xuanzang traditions, alluded to it earlier. The relation between an ostensibly language and culture transcending realization of the truth and the actual linguistic and cultural practices which either incite or express it. This is, of course, one of the perennial unresolved issues in these traditions, as in many religious traditions, a centerpiece of their own rhetoric and anti-rhetoric, and the engine for many of the most memorable and ingenious of the inventions and impasses of the canonical literature of these schools. But the problem is especially exacerbated, or perhaps given the room for a more expansive treatment in the special context of the fanciful, comical, allegorical novel we have before us, where the overflowing creative use of language and incident and the liberties taken with proprieties, doctrines, historical characters, and even deities is in high tension with the comically anticlimactic but bluntly symbolic blank, wordless pages of the scriptures the pilgrims end up receiving when they reach their destination. The effusiveness of the means and the austere emptiness of the goal, the end, is itself part of the allegory folded into this tale by virtue of the author's ingenious self-commentary, whereby his own allegorization is part of the subject matter of his allegory. This, of course, echoes the ancient dynamic, I think, of the two truths in Mahayana Buddhism, the relation of ultimate truth to conventional truth, and indeed particularly in the conflation of conventional truth and upaya, or skillful means, which we find in so much of Chinese Buddhism, that is, the expansion of conventional truth to also to the legitimate, sayable character of all sorts of diverse, creative upaya, skillful means. That is, what is at issue here is the vexed relationship so central to these traditions between the worded and the wordless, the mediated and the unmediated, the conditioned and the unconditioned, cataphatic and the apophatic maybe, the deft juxtaposition of these two forms of tension, that is, between official public policy and private transgression on the one hand, second tension between words and wordlessness on the other, which seems so central, a kind of nodal point around so much revolves in the book, and to which Professor Yu so effectively draws our attention in his introduction, reminded me of a brilliant and amusing phrase in the Chan Buddhist tradition, which seems to prefigure this convergence of these two tensions, and even to point to a deep collapsing of these two registers of tension embedded in Chinese religious culture. The phrase I have in mind appears at least as early as the Shaoshan biography in the Jingde Chuanmeng Lu of the year 1004. And that's the earliest I can find it, maybe somewhere earlier. And the phrase is this, Guan bu rong zhen si tong che ma, which means literally, officially, not even a needle is allowed to pass. Privately, carriages and horses get through. Okay? Guan bu rong zhen si tong che ma. This metaphor seems to be one of a customs official at a border. All the more apt for our surreptitiously border-crossing Xuanzang and his ambiguous fictional counterpart. The question is what is or is not permitted to go through, to get past this interface between the inner and the outer. Official policy stipulates that nothing shall pass, but privately, anything goes. Not a bad description of many arrangements, even in present-day China. The phrase is used in Chan dialogues in a typically compressed way for maximal ambiguity. It expresses, on the one hand, disapproval at a hypocrisy in context of dialogues, it appears, suggesting that someone has not really attained the high level of insight he had officially claimed, allowing huge errors to get through. So that's one meaning that seems to be always there in these dialogues. But the same phrase, at the same time reread, in typical Chan fashion, showing the literary ingenuity of the tradition, which is writ large in its continued ramifications in the novel here. The phrase is a folksy encapsulation of the technical Buddhist philosophical doctrine of the two truths, cast in the metaphors precisely of private and public, of strict official interdiction coexisting happily with under-the-counter backdoor folk practice. In this sense, the simultaneous meaning is something like this of this phrase. Although in ultimate truth, nothing exists, not even a needle, not the slightest entity, not the slightest conception, not the slightest language, yet in conventional truth, all and everything exists, a veritable circus of horses and carts and comings and goings and forms and thoughts and characters and narratives. The convergence of these two registers of meaning in this Chan metaphor perhaps points to a deep intertwining of these themes in the Chinese religious traditions under consideration here that inform this novel. The novel seems to be both an illustration of this point, that is, itself a carnivalesque passing of horses and carts through the border passes, official yet unofficial, getting something but getting nothing, saying something but saying nothing, and also, it's profound nonsense, right? As Wuxia said, and also a comment on this intertwining of themes itself. Ultimate truth intertwines with conventional truth in this book. Silence intertwines with narrative and poetry. Official interdiction intertwines with private transgression. History intertwines with poetic license. This seems to be one of several distinctively Chinese elaborations of the implications of the two truths doctrine, brilliantly ramified in this masterpiece of Chinese literature, and doubly ramified in its virtuosic English translation given us here in the newly refurbished edition. Its very departure from the official silence is its service to that silence. The novel, in all its exuberance, speaks loudly the blank pages of the sought-after sutras of truth. For putting this into such a viscerally powerful form on the page for the English reader, I join with the Dean, with Wendy, all of you, in expressing my admiration for the work, and my gratitude on behalf of English-speaking readers to Professor Yu. And I hope maybe as a last word, this will serve as an encouragement to all of you to go and read the book.
And I know it's time, so please feel free. You have classes and other engagements. I just want to thank the Dean and her very great kindness and generosity, all of you. I told my table companions already that I'm not in the habit these days to even take 3 meals a day, but usually 2 meals, a big breakfast and a big dinner. But I can't resist the wonderful salad and lovely soup. So they're worthy of much greater public notice. I just wanted to mention a couple of things, and I can stay here for a few more minutes for those of you who may have questions. But I thank my colleagues for their very perceptive, and because of the perception, that is the highest kind of kindness that they can bestow on me, of their remarks. Now, it's very interesting that both Professor Doniger and Professor Ziporyn talks about this almost double-sidedness of both text, language, and culture, among other things, all right? And Professor Doniger raises the question very, very certainly, legitimately, about whether India alone provided some of these materials for the story and so forth. And then she very, very deftly moves the themes of the story about the fictive hero and his family background, which is complete nonsense as far as history is concerned, out to even the context of world literature. And that's a very, very fruitful kind of discussion. But I wanted to emphasize something that I want to say to you, and to continually, insofar as I'm doing any kind of worthwhile intellectual work. I think I actually, in my last 10, 15 years, and then as I started to narrow and finally accepted both my responsibility and the challenge of trying to do a better translation at the end of my career, I was haunted more and more, if I sound polemical, I hope you will forgive me, by the current tendency of both Chinese and non-Chinese scholarship about China, about the unique and distinctively unique approach to anything cultural that is Chinese. It is something that I'm sorry to say, I have to say loudly and clearly that fundamentally my whole being rebels against that. For the simple reason that my own personal experience completely denies that. If there's the Chinese way of doing classical translation, I wouldn't be here. All right? Which is a contradiction in terms. All right? The easy solution is to say, oh, America, look, it doesn't even have a unified culture, it's pluralistic. We are Han people. We are indivisibly Chinese. Our territory, our lands are uniquely integral and whole. Now, the interesting thing is that, I'm sorry, the book, maybe that's the way why the book like Journey to the West is fundamentally flawed. Because even the fictional story denies the homogeneity that cannot be attained, that cannot be maintained intellectually. There's only one character, one brand. And this is the reason why I chose to frame it that way. To study Chinese religion, we have yet to understand in the scholarly world and to try to, I'm not saying that we have to have a unified discourse, but to have the proper recognition to say, when you talk about Chinese religion, like we do it in Swift Talk, when you talk about religion, you begin to stand immediately says, where, how, when, at what locale, who is talking about religion, etc., etc., etc. All right? And when you do that with just any portion of Chinese religiosity, you will see whether it be internally, that is to say within the Chinese region, within the culture, where it might be attached to, and how it positions itself towards the larger so-called context of Chinese religion. I mean, the analogy here is, I think all of you would agree with me, is with Chinese food. You see, you're going downtown to have Chinese food. I said, good luck. What do you want to eat? All right? And I think I can speak with great authority on that topic. All right? He said, I don't read Chinese. You know, what should I eat? It's not the language here. We have to find out what are the ingredients, you know. Maybe you are a vegetarian. Well, then we'll have to think about something. Maybe you only like fish, but you can't stand shellfish because of allergies. All right. It could be all. And the Chinese food is very, just like any social phenomenon, is a great index of an analogy, indexical analogy for politics and religion, among other things. So the thing, the other, precisely as I'll stop, I picked up the word in Professor Ziporyn's eloquent comment, the word marginalized. And what I wanted to try to point out repeatedly, at least in the introduction, is to say this is, again, a regrettable emphasis of Chinese intellectuals. They worship history, so-called, and marginalize fiction. As serious students of religion, as Professor Doniger and many of us try to tell you, you will never understand religion if you marginalize fiction and everything that word means. Thank you very much.
This was a really great day. This is what a Dean's Forum is supposed to be about. Both a magnificent work of scholarship and continual reflection on the work that we do as scholars. I want to thank each of the colleagues, all three virtuosi translators themselves, who have brought such keen insights to today, unforgettable. I want the Monkey King to have the last. The heaven-born monkey, strong in magic might, he left the mount and rode the raft to catch fair wind. He drifted across the sea to seek immortal's way, determined in heart and mind to achieve great things. It's his lot, his portion, to quit earthly zeals. Calm and carefree, he'll face a lofty sage. He'll meet, I think, a true, discerning friend. The source disclosed, all Dharma will be known. The Journey to the West.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.